Hi, my name is Lo, and welcome to the Romance Seriously podcast, where I take a serious look at romantic movies. Today, we're going old school with 1999's Runaway Bride, starring Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. We open on a lovely shot of a woman in a wedding dress riding a horse like a bat out of hell. Through woods, a lake, a pasture. Where was this wedding even being held that this is faster than a car? Richard Gere, meanwhile, is Ike Graham. He's a columnist living in New York, except for the slight detail of having no ideas for his next column. He ends up reduced to loitering in a bar, trying to both claw an article idea from and hit on a woman. Is that Stacy from House? But if push comes to shove, he'll take the idea. She is understandably insulted and leaves, but not before telling Ike and his misanthropic ways all the way off. However, a fellow bar patron, in a mix of rage and despondence, and against the will of the bartender, is that the dad from 10 Things I Hate About You? Feeds Ike a juicy tale. That of a girl from his hometown who has left not one, but 7 or 8 men at the altar, and keeps managing to find new victims. And who can resist a tale like that? Ike's column is certainly a choice. He starts by defending his reduction of women to archetypes because when going through life, he sees women in these archetypical roles of the virgin, the mother, the whore, the crone, before adding some new archetypes of the cheerleader, the co-ed, and the man-eater. You know what all of these have in common? They reduce women to their sexual availability to men. Ike's whole-ass thought process is, it's okay that I slot all women into boxes that relate to how likely they are to fuck me, because when I look at a random woman, I think she fits into one of my boxes. Lovely. He goes on to pontificate about the evil Maggie Carpenter, the titular runaway bride, comparing her to several man-eating deities, including the Greek Erinyes. It's a skosh odd Ike didn't use the more common English name of the Furies, except that if you have a passing familiarity with Greek mythology, you'd know the Furies weren't misandrists, they were godly enforcers, and Greek men just often did stupid shit that required justice be done upon them. I wonder if that'll come back. Maggie, meanwhile, played by Roberts, is working at her family's hardware store in Hale, Maryland. She seems to be taking the public thrashing very well, to the shock of her friends, until she congratulates them on such an excellent bachelorette prank. When they carefully break the news that, no, that actually is a nationally syndicated column, Maggie understandably freaks out. But after a cathartic round with a punching bag, Maggie channels her very valid rage into a very mature response. An erudite letter to the editor, in which she calls out Ike's incredibly inaccurate writing. The women of New York City are appalled at Ike and start avoiding him like the plague, which, good, but also the original was incredibly misogynistic and none of y'all cared. Was this what the 90s were like? Sexism was fine until it was factually inaccurate? The letter itself is quite well written, with enough sass that even Ike is impressed. In any event, given that Maggie included a laundry list of lies that Ike told about her, her one request from her fellow man-eater, Ike's editor and ex-wife Ellie, that Ike be fired, is to be granted. Hilariously, Ellie has even brought in her current husband, Fisher, to provide Ike moral support. Is that Joe from The Princess Diaries? Ike tries to argue that he had a source, and, no. A drunk dude in a bar told me does not override the need for basic fact-checking. Ellie holds firm. As she says, check your sources is literally the first rule of journalism, and Ike's failure to do so is so egregious that she cannot do anything else even if she wanted to. And going by the death glare, she doesn't. Back in Maryland, Maggie is delighted to see the retraction and news of Ike's firing, and she excitedly tells her current fiancé, Bob Kelly. Is that Elliot Stabler? Still in New York City, Fisher gives Ike an idea, that he write a new article on Maggie. Not a retraction, but a clarification, one that nails all the nitty-gritty details, like a responsible journalist would have done the first time, as a freelancer for a different publication. Plus, she's getting married soon, and if she bolts again, Ike will have a cover story. Ike thinks it's a good idea, and it's not like he has any other prospects, so he heads down to Hale. He's quickly clocked as a reporter by Maggie's best friend, Peggy Fleming, not the figure skater. Is that Debbie from the Addams Family? Maggie, however, clocks him as the reporter, the one who wrote the damn article in the first place. Together, she and Peggy have a little fun with the city slicker, telling him bullshit tales of Maggie having bad dreams about her upcoming wedding while giving him a rainbow dye job. To Ike's credit, he takes it on the chin, simply asking directions to the drugstore to buy some shampoo. Maggie tells Ike that if he's looking for her to suffer, that's a lost cause, because he cannot bother her anymore. At her needling, Ike retorts that he's in hail for vindication, that he was right about her, and when she leaves groom number 4, he'll be waiting to write about it, because she ruined his life. Maggie walks off because, unlike Ike, she still has a job. Again, this happened because Ike wrote a nasty hit piece on a stranger after one conversation in a bar and didn't bother to fact-check anything. To her horror, though, when Maggie arrives home that night, Ike is there, along with Bob, chatting about her past weddings. When Maggie is understandably pissed off, her father tries to calm her down, claiming that Ike apologized, that he's only human and should be forgiven. I cannot help but notice that he didn't give that apology to Maggie, the person he actually defamed. Also, her family is just chatting with the stranger who trashed their daughter/granddaughter/fiancé in a national paper. If someone did that to someone I knew tangentially, let alone loved, I'd smack them and then show them the door, not invite them to dinner. Maggie quickly flees the room, bringing Bob with her, but Ike sticks with her father and grandmother. He learns that Maggie's mom passed away, that each wedding was caught on tape, and that her father has zero compunctions about making jokes at his daughter's expense, saying she might not be Hale's longest-running joke, but she is the fastest. Over dinner, Maggie defends herself and her fiancé to Ike. The wedding is on her own dime, her fiancé is the head of the PE department at the high school, and he's climbed Everest. Twice! They're even planning to trek through the Himalayas for their honeymoon. Later that night, Ike watches Maggie's previous wedding videos. The first is Woodstock, wedding edition, the second a staid and reserved church affair, and the third an old-fashioned outdoor wedding, which does explain the opening, but also, do not be that asshole who hosts your wedding in the middle of nowhere but still expects your guests to show up in formal dress. The next day, Ike spots the hardware truck and comes across Maggie picking cake toppers for her wedding next Sunday. Maggie is dithering over which one looks the most like Bob, and Ike helps by using 2 of them to reenact a WWE match. Gee, I wonder why his wife left him. He manages to finagle an invite to Maggie's pre-wedding luau before skulking off. Maggie goes to visit Bob at work, only to find Ike already there. Ike takes his leave quickly, but Maggie just turns her anger and annoyance on Bob, who invited Ike to the wedding. She asks if he realizes Ike is writing another article on her, and Bob says yes, but Maggie's not running this time, so who cares? Let us take a moment to appreciate this kind man who believes in his fiancée wholeheartedly and is clearly expecting the reporter to end up with egg on his face despite all past evidence. If you find yourself a Bob Kelly, cherish him. Maggie goes to confession, wanting to know if she can Hail Mary her way out of the desires for vengeance and retribution Ike inspires in her, but gets annoyed when the priest, Brian, calls her my child because it turns out that the priest is ex number 2. Is that Harvey Bullock from Gotham? She tries to warn him that Ike might be showing up to ask ridiculous questions, only it turns out Ike got there first. Brian is nonchalant because he feels he painted Maggie in a good light. Ike asked what their relationship was like, and if Maggie had ruined his life when she left. Brian answered no. How could it, when it led him to the priesthood, his true path? Maggie thanks him for the save, but it's clear he meant it. Brian sincerely believes his and Maggie's lives are better for her having ran. As Maggie leaves, she apologizes for having hurt him, but it's clear there's no bad blood. Brian does tell her that Ike asked one ridiculous question. How did Maggie like her eggs? Scrambled with salt and dill. Same as him, if you're wondering. Maggie next heads to ex-fiancé 1, Gil. From him, Ike gets a photo of Maggie topless in San Francisco in her rocker era. Ike also reveals that the matching tattoo she got with him was a stick-on the entire time, after pressuring her to show if she still had it. Delightful. And unlike Brian, Gil is clearly heartbroken. Ike continues to ingratiate himself with the Hale locals. At a town baseball game, he even manages to charm Peggy into revealing that back in high school her husband dated Maggie, digging up some insecurities that Peggy didn't even realize she had. Maggie confronts Ike about running off her friend, but Ike simply tells her that she has no idea what she leaves in her wake. The next morning, Maggie asks Peggy if she thinks she flirts with her husband. Peggy says yes without hesitation. She doesn't hold it against Maggie, though. Maggie unconsciously flirts with everyone, exuding an energy of magnetic, quirky mystery that she doesn't even realize she has. But now Maggie knows, so she can do with that knowledge what she wants. That night, Maggie decides to break into Ike's room for some revenge snooping. Unfortunately, she doesn't manage to get out before Ike returns. She escapes through the bathroom window, but Ike is, for once, rightfully pissed at her, and threatens to call the cops. Maggie, though, is so over him that she just asks for Ike to remind him to bring the wine for the luau. It'll save her a call. In her home, Maggie looks over Ike's notes while listening to a jazz tape she stole from him. The next morning, she returns to Ike's room to offer him a deal. As he's still getting the story wrong, she'll give him access to her and agree to an interview for $1,000. Ike barters it down to $650 and off they go. 2 points of note. 1. Either inflation is way worse than I realized, or Maggie is severely undervaluing herself. And B. This is the first conversation we've seen between the two leads of this romantic comedy where the hero isn't relentlessly harassing the heroine, and it's the halfway point. Maggie takes Ike to her workshop, where she makes lamps from repurposed industrial parts. Ike is legitimately impressed, telling Maggie she could probably make it in the New York art scene, which Maggie appreciates as that's her goal someday. Not now, though. Someday. She then shows Ike her collection of engagement rings, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but shouldn't she have given those back? Because she called it off, she has to return the rings. In any event, Maggie tells Ike about the proposals that went with each, with number 3 hiding it in a cocoon at a butterfly farm, he's an entomologist, and Bob proposing during the 7th-inning stretch of a Major League Baseball game, complete with a scoreboard. Ike, though, isn't impressed. And not for the reasons you'd think. Ike is of the opinion that the bells and whistles just show how little faith one has in a relationship. Relationships are hard, they have rough patches, and there will be a time when one or both parties wants to GTFO. But if it's real, the highs are worth the inevitable lows. That is oddly romantic from a man who cannot seem to wrap his head around women's lives not being dictated by their relationships to men. Even Maggie is touched by Ike's view, though she plays it off as still sounding better on a scoreboard. She asks about his prior marriage and why it ended. When Ike says he doesn't know, she suggests asking Ellie, and it's painfully clear that idea never occurred to Ike before. They next head to a bridal shop, where Maggie intends to buy a new wedding dress, as she can now afford the one she really wanted. For her wedding in, 3 days. The seamstress, though, talks Maggie out of it, as the new one is more than 3 times the cost, and, well, Maggie only wears them for 10 minutes. Ike takes offense and convinces the shop owner to sell Maggie the new dress. Which is fair, Maggie does have the money, but, Ike, buddy, you shamed her in a national publication without ever meeting her. The seamstress just wants Maggie to make good fiscal choices. Ike is visibly stunned when Maggie tries her new dress on, to the point of reading his newspaper upside down. Maggie is thrilled with his reaction, but Ike deliberately throws cold water on their moment by remarking how much Bob will like it. Which reminds Maggie they need to meet him. At the diner, Bob orders a garden omelet, egg whites only, and Maggie decides to get the same, which irks Ike. Maggie starts going at him again, but Bob plays referee and defends Maggie, saying that her past issues come from not focusing enough on the relationship itself, which is a valid point, though his use of visualization exercises might not be the most helpful response. Ike's next stop is Maggie's grandmother, who, under the impression her granddaughter is still a doe-eyed virgin, tells Ike that Maggie's fear isn't the wedding as much as the wedding night. Why, she brought a knitting needle to her wedding bed! After Maggie gently reminds her grandma that she is not pure as the driven snow, she gives Ike a rare Miles Davis album she found cleaning out the attic, having learned his taste from her burglary escapade. Maggie tries to brush it off as no big deal. Ike is starting to see why men keep flinging themselves at Maggie, and Grandma senses trouble. Later on, Maggie picks her dad up from the bar, apparently a regular occurrence. When Ike spots them, Maggie is, for the first time, terrified, but Ike assures her that her father's drinking won't end up in the article. Instead, he suggests leaving her dad to sleep it off and joining him for a drive. As they meander, they share tales of their parents. When Maggie's mother died, her dad turned to the bottle to cope, and Maggie had to drop out of college to run the hardware store. Ike, meanwhile, was the child of a printer who wanted his son to be a classical musician, and Mother wanted him to be a novelist, so they're 0 for 2 on the disappointment scale. Not long after, Ike's city boy ways lead to his rental car breaking down because apparently you have to be a country person to pay attention to what fuel you're using. Walking for help, they both agree that too often attraction is mistaken for love, while sharing a charged moment of just such a thing. The next day, Ike heads back to New York to interview the original source, who also turns out to be groom number 3. He's still bitter, but when he clocks that Ike has also started to fall under Maggie's spell, he's almost sympathetic. He heads out, leaving Ike to his fate, but does answer when asked how Maggie took her eggs. Poached, like him. Ike takes advantage of his return to New York to have dinner with Ellie and Fisher. He asks Ellie why their marriage ended, and she confirms that it was because Ike didn't really see her, to the shock of no one. Back in Hale, the luau is going great, except that Maggie is more concerned with Ike's lack of presence than with Bob. You know, her fiancé. Supposedly, she's trying to keep her enemy closer, but Maggie perks right up when Peggy points out Ike, and the two begin flirting shamelessly while Bob wins the limbo contest. A round of toasts start, with many townspeople including comments about Maggie hopefully not running this time. The constant digs, including her father repeating the joke about being Hale's fastest-running joke, start to visibly weigh on Maggie. Ike asks if Maggie is okay, but everyone tells him to make a toast as well. Ike does so, toasting that may the townspeople be publicly flogged for all their bad choices. You do remember how you got here, right, Ike? Maggie ends up leaving. Peggy starts to follow her, but when Ike chases her too, she hands him Maggie's coat and plays interference for Bob. Maggie tries to yell at Ike for humiliating her and making everyone feel sorry for her, while Ike argues that he was the only one defending her. Again, do you not remember the original fucking article, Ike? It's been less than a week. The two fight, Maggie claiming that she is just very supportive of her fiancés, but Ike accurately points out that, really? Maggie has no sense of self. She lets herself become whatever the current man wants her to be, to the point of not knowing what kind of eggs she actually likes instead of agreeing with whatever her current beau eats. Ike tells her that she really wants a guy who is as enthusiastic about her as she is about them, but Maggie cuts him off. She accuses him of just trying to make her run again to sell his article, of being a mean, cynical creep. So Maggie is also right. After they both condemn each other for being lost, there comes another moment where it seems their simmering chemistry is about to break through when Bob reappears to bring Maggie back inside. The next morning, Maggie finally tells off her dad for his jokes about her, that they're mean, and while he may not like her problems, she doesn't like his any better. They move on to the wedding rehearsal, so Maggie can visualize the ceremony better. Bob offers to have Ike leave, but Maggie insists he stay and take the part of the pastor. Peggy questions this decision as she saw what happened at the luau, but things go ahead. Here comes the bride starts, and Maggie is having a bit of a speed problem with her walk up the aisle, in that an arthritic snail would smoke her. Bob pulls Ike in to take his place while he goes to encourage Maggie and walk her up. This does in fact help, because Maggie is now walking to Ike and not Bob. Unfortunately for Bob, who is just trying to be supportive and understanding, Ike and Maggie decide to take his kiss the bride as an instruction and proceed to start making out. Peggy's frustrated scream of "No!" is all of us, because this is a terrible idea. Bob, bless his soul, tries to let Maggie off the hook by saying good job visualizing him and asking Ike, what the hell? But alas, Ike and Maggie are not to be denied. Ike even has the balls to suggest that what Bob can say to this is, I hope you're happy together, which, no! You just broke up his engagement. He does not owe you anything but a punch. Which he delivers. Good for Bob. Bob leaves, deservedly, as Maggie tries to reassure Bob that he'll find another woman. Hilariously, a blonde girl proves the point by chasing after him and giving him her number. And I don't blame her. Bob Kelly is a treasure. Maggie and Ike talk. Well, first they kiss some more, and then they talk. Ike points out that Maggie already has the dress and the church, so why not use them? Well, maybe because you've known each other for a week and you spent half of it treating her like absolute shit? We get a montage of Ike and Maggie blissfully spending time together, also known as the honeymoon phase. On the dawn of wedding number 4, it must be a slow-as-hell news day, because there are multiple reporters there to cover the wedding, in addition to t-shirt hawkers and general looky-loos. Maggie is starting to spiral at the media circus. Ike is also not thrilled. Bob shows up to offer genuine support and tells Ike to maintain eye contact to reassure Maggie as she walks down the aisle. She does pause on the way up, but Bob's eye contact tip helps, and Maggie gets there. Until a flash goes off and she spooks like a horse. And bolts like one. Ike puts up a good chase, even running after a FedEx truck, but alas, Maggie gets away. And the story does end up on the front page. Peggy stops by to tell Maggie she still thinks Ike's the one, she just needs to get her own shit sorted out first. We get a montage of Ike and Maggie moping, Ike seeing Maggie's lamps for sale in a New York shop, and Maggie trying every form of egg known to man. Eventually, Ike returns to his apartment to find Maggie in it. She apologizes to Ike for running. Before, she'd been running from men who didn't really know her, which she admits is her own fault, but with Ike, he knew her, but she didn't know herself. Which is true, but I don't think figuring out you like Eggs Benedict qualifies as knowing yourself. Maggie then proposes to Ike, echoing his earlier speech about marriage being hard but worth it with the right person. Ike accepts, and she and Ike get married in a quiet ceremony on a hilltop, much to the joy of everybody else. God bless the chemistry between Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, because that is the only reason this movie is watchable. Once again, we have a love story between two horrible people, but at least there's enough spark between them to make it interesting to watch. You know, I've done some last-minute writing in my time. I've written academic papers and album reviews with 20 minutes until the deadline. But that's the writing. The opinions, the thoughts, the comparison points, the fucking research, I do well beforehand. And I actually do it. I officially put more work into this podcast that 5 people listen to than this man does for a well-circulated column. How does any movie expect me to sympathize with a hero whose big problem is his own refusal to do his job in accordance with industry standards? The whole first half boils down to Ike being pissy he is suffering consequences for his actions. And then, once he spends 5 cordial minutes with Maggie, Ike magically changes. He starts to take offense at people making reference to her multiple weddings, which is kind of hard to reconcile with him being the kind of person who has no compunctions about demonizing a stranger. He's incensed at people making jokes, which, yes, are mean, but are not nationally syndicated. Literally, halfway through the movie, Ike just becomes a decent person. Because apparently, that's what the mystique of Maggie can do. It can force a 50-year-old misogynist to suddenly realize that women are people and have things other than their fuckability to men going on in their heads. I'm not being hyperbolic either. Ike is stunned when Maggie introduces him to the idea that women have thoughts and feelings not about men. He does, however, have a very pretty cat. And yet, while Ike never considers women, Maggie never considers herself. She never takes stock of her own actions. Maggie is utterly oblivious to how she comes across, but more importantly, she never attempts any introspection as to why she acts the way she does. 1 fled wedding, sure, you panicked. But 3? Without ever thinking, what is it about me that has led to this pattern? She is willfully oblivious to her own culpability, just blithely expecting her life to fix itself without her having to do anything. And yes, it sucks realizing that it's you. Hi, you're the problem, it's you. But it beats repeating the same mistakes over and over and dragging God knows how many innocent people into your shit show. In the words of Rocket Raccoon, everybody has dead people. That's not an excuse to get other people dead along the way. You know what Maggie really needs? To be single. And not for a couple of weeks. For like a year. Minimum. I mean, the opening song is I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. It says it all right there. Ike was right about Maggie not knowing who she is and molding herself to each man, and that habit doesn't break in a month. Marrying Ike will not fix this problem. but spending some serious time on her own and learning who she is, independent of her relationship with men in any capacity, including her father, would. I think everyone should spend some length of time single for this reason, but especially women, as we are always the ones told to bend for the sake of harmony. Doing what Maggie does is a great way to blink and find yourself 20 years later and realizing you have no idea who the fuck you are because you have always defined yourself by other people. Know yourself and everything else will be on a much more stable foundation. And no, finally figuring out what eggs you like doesn't really qualify as that. Runaway Bride reunited Gere and Roberts with Gary Marshall, who directed them in Pretty Woman. And I'm pretty sure that most of the goodwill for this movie is inertia from that one, which is legitimately great. How is it the movie about the hooker and the John is the one with the more functional relationship? Marshall wasn't a flashy director. He had more of an everyman style. What he was a great actor's director. He can get great performances out of anyone, and that is on full display here. Gere and Roberts are somehow still likable in the moment, charming and sincere as they reluctantly fall in love over 3 days. The fact that this is remotely plausible is down to their incredible performances, but it's not just them. Joan Cusack as Peggy is great. I genuinely love Peggy. Peggy understands that Maggie legitimately doesn't understand how people, especially men, see her. And she never attributes to malice what she knows is actually ignorance. Peggy's grounded and confident in herself and her marriage, and she never holds the charisma that Maggie exudes against her, because if Maggie didn't have it, she wouldn't be Maggie. But she does encourage self-reflection when Maggie naturally hits on the moments that start to make her question herself. It's also the truly excellent Bob Kelly. Love him, worship him, cherish him. He deserves none of the bullshit he goes through and is totally confident Maggie will marry him up until the moment she's making out with Ike at the altar. I really hope he's happy with the blonde chick because he deserves a truly great relationship. And while a good chunk of the greatness of the supporting characters is from the writing, a bigger piece is the performances. Everybody from Joan Cusack to the extras is giving a perfect performance, with enough subtlety and restraint to ground them and make them feel realistic, but also provide nuance and warmth. Rita Wilson and Hector Elizondo are great as Ike's only friends, showing worry and concern, but also joy that he's finally turned a corner in his life and being realistically happy in their own marriage. The residents of Hale all straddle the line between well-meaning and nosy, between optimistic and thoughtlessly cruel. It's the kind of small-town environment that can and does happen in real life, only slightly played up for the screen. That is helped along by the truly great casting for all the minor roles in this movie. Runaway Bride is a great movie for playing "Hey, it's that guy" bingo, which is probably the only way in which I'd say it's great. Other examples not mentioned previously include Sheldon Cooper's mom, the dad from 16 Candles, and adult Chrissy from Now and Then. Roberts and Gere have great chemistry. Marshall directed them and everyone else fabulously. There's that grounded tone that makes 90s rom-coms so charming, because they feel so close to life, like they could actually happen. And yet, it doesn't matter how good everything else is when the actual story isn't just bland, but legitimately bad. You cannot fix a broken foundation with really good wallpaper and top-notch electrical wiring. And a man who feels comfortable flogging complete strangers and a woman with no sense of self falling in love in a week, half of which is spent in verbal combat at best, is one fucking hell of a broken foundation. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, review, all those things. Or find me at the Romance Seriously Podcast at gmail.com or romancesrsly on Twitter. See you next time.